attach great importance to the indigenous population of America. Should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will become so illumined as to enlighten the whole world. Al-Baha. The original population of the United States was very dear to Al-Baha's heart, and he foretold for the Indians a great future if they accepted and became enlightened by the teachings of Baha'u'llah. To believe in the mouthpiece of God in this day confers very great blessings, not only on individuals, but on races. And he hopes that you who are now numbered amongst the followers of Baha'u'llah will give his message to many more of your tribe, and in this way hasten for your people a bright and happy future. Shoghi Effendi.
Thank you. So today our speaker is Mr. Michael Orona, and his topic is how Indigenous knowledge systems align with Baha'i principles. Michael Orona has served for over 20 years in senior level foreign policy positions at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C. This includes serving at the White House as National Security Council Director and the U.S. Embassy in Vietnam, where he negotiated the release of three prisoners of conscience. In 2004, Mr. Orona established and led the State Department's Sudan Atrocities documentation team, which was dispatched by former Secretary of State Colin Powell to investigate the violence in Darfur. The investigation led to the Department of State's determination of genocide. In 2021, Michael was selected to serve as the State Department's Senior Advisor for International Indigenous Issues. He co-led the White House Committee on International Indigenous Issues and served to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples around the world. Michael received a Juris Doctorate in International Law and an MS in Strategic Policy Studies. He's a lifetime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Orona is a member of the Chihene Apache tribe and of Yaqui ancestry. His recent novel, The Brave Ones, is a historical Indigenous Yaqui perspective on the struggle for equality and social justice. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Orona.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. I could start by saying good morning, but I guess I could also start by saying good afternoon because it's afternoon where I am and morning for others. So again, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It is truly an honor to be part of this conversation, and I know it happens weekly, so I'm honored to be asked to return and be here this morning and to talk about today's discussion on how Indigenous knowledge systems align with Baha'i principles. And it was shared in my bio that I am a U.S. government official. So let me state first and foremost that yes, I am a U.S. government official, but the thoughts and ideas expressed today are my own as an Indigenous person and as a member of the Baha'i faith. So today's presentation is not official U.S. government policy. Now, I do work here in Washington, D.C., but I am originally from the southwestern United States, born in Arizona and raised in New Mexico from parents of Apache and Yaqui Native American ancestry. And I'm honored that my mother and other relatives could be on today. Now, before we begin, it is customary for Native peoples to introduce ourselves in our native language, and I would like to start by introducing myself and welcome everyone in my father's language of Apache. Inde biate tanisho, inde nishli, desh shia sanseze. Ina biate Michael Orona shise. Shimana kayi yome yaki. Hike shita chehen inde. Also, I want to dedicate today's presentation to my Indigenous brothers and sisters from around the world that continue to help promote a more peaceful global community. And remember the numerous and dedicated elders who took the time when we were young to guide us, to educate us, and to prepare us for this special time in history, so that we as Indigenous peoples can share our unique perspectives, our spiritual qualities and blessings to continue to make this world more secure, more prosperous, and more stable for the entire global community. So today, it's with that same premise of acknowledgement that I have focused my presentation on a topic that I believe is not just historically significant, but critically relevant to our shared future. Understanding how Indigenous knowledge systems foster greater stability and prosperity and are in alignment with the principles of the Baha'i faith. When we gather together and discuss this current state of affairs around the world, when we come together to discuss international relations or global stability or international development, we too often overlook one of humanity's most valuable resources, the knowledge, the traditions, and the spiritual leadership of Indigenous peoples around the world. Now, I say this because our world is interconnected in so many ways that underscore the importance of recognizing the prominent role Indigenous peoples have played and continue to play in promoting a more unified world. And let me start today by sharing a striking reality, and you can see this on the screen there in front of you. Indigenous peoples represent approximately 5,000 diverse cultures and speak 4,000 of the world's 7,000 languages. Nearly 500 million Indigenous people live across 90 countries around the world, each community carrying centuries, again, centuries of accumulated wisdom in support of sustainable living, governance, and peaceful coexistence. Indigenous peoples from around the world possess invaluable traditional knowledge systems that have been developed, and I would also add refined through centuries of lived experience. Furthermore, the inherent regard of Indigenous peoples for the environment, the recognition and respect of different cultures, and the collective governance systems offers significant insight into fostering peace at a local, regional, and a global level. I would also add that Indigenous peoples are stewards of a wide and diverse range of critical issues. We, as Indigenous peoples, are a source of traditional knowledge and strategies on sustainability. This includes, but not limited to, strategies on climate change, on food security, on equitable governance, on gender equality and global peace building. As Indigenous peoples, we have an extensive and well-documented history of sharing intergenerational knowledge and spiritual wisdom that I believe is essential to the prosperity and the very existence and survival of the entire global community. Quite a challenge, but quite a blessing as well. Indigenous peoples have played a key role in making our world more stable and prosperous for all people, and we're going to talk about some of that today. However, I also believe it is important to underscore that when it comes to global discourse, Indigenous voices and perspectives for too long have been disregarded. Global Indigenous peoples are among the world's most marginalized groups. Indigenous peoples throughout the world have historically faced discrimination and systemic disparities that have prevented us from reaching our true potential and playing a more productive role in global affairs, and I would underscore, all to the detriment of humanity. The marginalization of Indigenous peoples is a significant threat to global security and stability. And I want to emphasize that again. Again, the marginalization of Indigenous peoples is a significant threat to the global security and stability of our global community, of our entire world. Now, this concept of Indigenous peoples playing a key role in the development of a more secure and prosperous world received the attention and absolute global awareness of the United Nations during the past 2 decades. So this is something that the United Nations has focused on definitely within the past 2 decades. However, the acknowledgement of the important role Indigenous peoples will play in this global process started much, much earlier in history. Now, in fact, one of the first individuals to publicly acknowledge the key role Indigenous people will play in bringing about a more unified world was Abdu'l-Baha. And Abdu'l-Baha is pictured here on this slide. Abdu'l-Baha was born in Persia, which is now Iran, and lived from 1844 to 1921. Now, Abdu'l-Baha was the son of the Prophet Baha'u'llah, and to Baha'is, he is seen as an exemplar of how we should conduct our own lives. In 1912, Abdu'l-Baha traveled to the United States and to Canada. And it was during this visit that he met with diverse audiences, spoke at numerous gatherings, and shared the Baha'i vision of the oneness of humanity. Now, during his visit, Abdu'l-Baha stated the following, and I quote, and the quote is there on the screen in front of us. The American continent gives signs and evidences of very great advancement. Its future is even more promising, for its influence and illumination are far-reaching, and it will lead the world spiritually. End quote. Now, later, on April 8th, 1916, Abdu'l-Baha revealed a special tablet addressed to the Baha'is of the United States and to Canada. And in that tablet, he acknowledged and he recognized the special station of Indigenous peoples. According to the teachings of Abdu'l-Baha, Indigenous peoples of America possess unique spiritual qualities that are essential to humanity's evolutionary journey. Spiritual qualities, again, these are spiritual qualities that go far beyond current conventional understanding of leadership or cultural contribution. Far beyond that, according to Abdu'l-Baha. I believe the Baha'i vision for America's spiritual destiny is intricately linked to Abdu'l-Baha's profound spiritual prophecy of Indigenous peoples serving as critical architects of a transformative global consciousness. Now, at the core of Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy, is a deep recognition of the spiritual wisdom and traditional knowledge inherent in Indigenous culture. Now, in support of the prominent role Indigenous peoples will play, Abdu'l-Baha stated the following in 1916, and I quote again, "Attach great importance to the Indigenous population of America. Should they be educated and guided, there can be no doubt that they will be so illumined as to enlighten the whole world." End quote. Again, Abdu'l-Baha, 1916. For centuries, Indigenous traditions have maintained a holistic worldview that emphasizes the interconnectedness of all life, a foundational belief that corresponds directly with the Baha'i principle of unity. Furthermore, Indigenous stewardship, reverence for nature, a profound belief in the Creator, and a sincere acknowledgement and appreciation in the establishment of a unified global community represents, I believe, a spiritual blueprint. It represents, I would say, an Indigenous spiritual blueprint that can guide humanity away from the destructive path of materialism, intolerance, prejudice, and environmental degradation. And I would add, by imparting long-held beliefs and traditions of harmony, sacred interconnection, and the collective well-being, Indigenous peoples can surely inspire a fundamental global shift. Again, I would say a global shift in human awareness, one that recognizes the spiritual dimension of the oneness of all living beings. Now, we've all taking the time to gather today on Saturday to meet here via Zoom, July 2025. And at this time, it would be absolutely appropriate for me to say that Indigenous peoples will play a prominent role. It would be absolutely appropriate for anyone to say that Indigenous peoples should play an important role in today's society. It would be absolutely appropriate, no doubt. But the message revealed by Abdu'l-Baha in support of Indigenous peoples was delivered in 1916. So let's just take a moment to think about the timing of Abdu'l-Baha's message and why it is, again, so important. 1916, the time that Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy was revealed, 1916 was a time when boarding schools were being used by the US government to forcibly assimilate Native American children. Native children were forcibly taken from their families, not allowed to speak their own language, no longer allowed to pray in their traditional way, forced to end the practice of traditional culture. The motto of the day was kill the Indian and save the man. Or as one boarding school survivor shared with me not too long ago, the motto was assimilate or exterminate. Now, we are all too familiar with the beatings, the horrific abuse, and the untold number of deaths that took place at these boarding schools. And I would add that Abdu'l-Baha's recognition of Indigenous peoples came at a time when in this country, in the United States, Native Americans were not even citizens of our own country. We would not be legally recognized by the government as US citizens until 1924. And again, Abdu'l-Baha's profound message was revealed in 1916. Again, here is Abdu'l-Baha during a tragic time in our history, a tragic time for Indigenous peoples, at this same time delivering a profound message in support of my ancestors and generations to come, in support of the powerful and the prominent role Indigenous peoples will play in enlightening the entire world. Again, not the region, not the country, but the entire world. Again, these are his words, not mine. Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy offers that Indigenous peoples, America, will enlighten the world by offering a transformative approach to addressing global challenges. And I would offer that Indigenous traditional knowledge, spiritual wisdom, resilience, all provide a critical alternative to the fragmented, individualistic worldview that currently dominates global culture. Now, I want to take some time to take a closer look at how Indigenous traditional knowledge systems, Indigenous spiritual wisdom, beliefs, perspectives, and values align with the principles of the Baha'i faith and Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy of Indigenous peoples enlightening the world. And I also want to share how Indigenous beliefs and knowledge systems are essential to addressing contemporary global challenges. One of the principles central to the Baha'i faith is the equality of men and women. The Baha'i faith teaches that gender equality is essential for social progress and the well-being and advancement of humanity. One of the first examples of Indigenous contributions and spiritual beliefs that are in alignment with Baha'i principles that I would like to highlight is gender equality. And I believe it is important to start with gender equality because Indigenous women in leadership positions absolutely merits special attention. And this is where I want to start. This is when I truly want to underscore this. And I say this because historically, many Indigenous cultures supported women in leadership positions long before, again, long before the equality of men and women became a global conversation. Because of this tradition, Indigenous women today continue to be at the forefront of human rights advocacy, environmental protection, and community development. And also, it's important because any dialogue or conversation that we have on creating greater global security or prosperity or unity for all people absolutely must include the topic of gender equality. And I say this because this important topic spans social, economic, and political dimensions. And I would add that according to a 2022 report from the World Bank, greater support for gender equality unlocks economic productivity, increases innovation, reduces poverty, deepens social cohesion, and enhances the well-being and prosperity for current and future generations. The bottom line, when women thrive, communities and countries thrive. And I would add that this is a fundamental fact known to Indigenous peoples for centuries. Today, around the world, Indigenous women serve as leaders, as decision makers, as advisors. They play a crucial leadership role in the struggle for self-determination. They serve as advocates for the protection and promotion of Indigenous rights around the world. And as I previously mentioned, the traditional role of Indigenous women serving in leadership positions is absolutely well documented. Now, historically, many, not all, but many, a majority of Indigenous societies are matriarchal. And prior to colonization, Indigenous women held powerful leadership positions and were absolutely central to the community decision-making process. In many Indigenous cultures, women not only had the power to serve as leaders, but they also had the power to elect tribal chiefs. Indigenous women also had the authority, the power, the authority to remove male leaders, male chiefs from leadership positions if the leader's conduct was detrimental to the tribe or the community at large. Such a powerful, powerful responsibility. And it's also important to underscore that women serving in leadership positions is not foreign or unfamiliar to Indigenous peoples. In fact, it is very much accepted, expected, and it's customary. And I would certainly add that my courageous Indigenous sisters all around the world continue to play a key role today. Many of them, like our elders before, serve as spiritual guides, as the first educators of the family. And without the leadership of Indigenous women and their significant role they play as the first educators of the family and as trailblazers, the culture of Indigenous peoples would be profoundly diminished. Their contributions are essential to cultural preservation and the spiritual, social, and economic advancement of all people. Now, another significant Indigenous contribution that is in direct correlation with Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy and the principles of the Baha'i faith is global peace building. The Baha'i faith teaches that peace building is both a spiritual and a practical imperative, central to humanity's development. A central belief in the Baha'i faith. Global peace building is a crucial topic where Indigenous peoples, once again, we demonstrate our essential role in ensuring the progress of a more unified world. Indigenous peoples worldwide have long-standing traditions of peace building and diplomacy embedded and firmly grounded in spiritual values and traditions of consultation and interconnectedness. Now, these approaches, developed over centuries, are increasingly recognized as vital contributions to resolving contemporary global conflicts and fostering sustainable relationships. Now, Abdu'l-Baha also stated, and I quote, that peace is the illumination of the world of humanity. And I would underscore, it is the traditional approaches to peace building from an indigenous perspective, again, developed through generations of lived experience, that offers crucial insight for fostering greater stability and harmony around the world. Now, unfortunately, for so long, these unique indigenous approaches based on spiritual values have been overlooked and disregarded until now. And I say until now because I want to highlight some of the photos there on the screen in front of us are from the very first Global Indigenous Peace Building Summit that took place just about a year ago in Washington, D.C. And I was absolutely honored to participate in this event and give remarks at the summit, along with a host of incredible participants. This included the former U.S. Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, who's pictured there on the screen, Chief Willie Littlechild, who's on the screen, and Bear Clan mother Louise McDonald Hearn. All of us were brought together to be part of this summit. And the summit brought together government officials, and over 120 Indigenous peace builders, elders, women, and youth from over 30 countries around the world to discuss, to strategize, and to collaborate on the topic of global Indigenous peace building. It was a truly groundbreaking initiative that continues today. Any discussion on Indigenous knowledge systems and the alignment with Baha'i principles must also include alternative Indigenous approaches to conflict resolution. Indigenous approaches to conflict resolution often emphasize restoration. They emphasize community healing rather than individual retribution. Many Indigenous communities prioritize justice over punitive measures, and this long-established tradition prioritizes reconciliation between conflicting parties and reintegration into the community. And one example of restorative justice from an Indigenous perspective includes the practice of peacemaking circles, which is used by a variety of Indigenous tribes. Now, for those unfamiliar with the peacemaking circle, let me give you an example, an illustration of what that's like. The foundation of the peacemaking circle is to gather all affected parties. All affected parties come together to openly discuss the conflict with a focus on a shared responsibility. And this is important. There's a shared responsibility on all of this. So the shared responsibility is that all participants invited to join the circle are considered key members in finding a solution. So everyone has a responsibility here. And the goal of the peacemaking circle is to restore justice, is to rebuild relationships, and to address the root cause or causes of the conflict through consultation. We do this through consultation so that it decreases the likelihood of the conflict happening again. And this, I would say, is restorative and transformational rather than transactional. And in accordance with Indigenous traditional knowledge, the Baha'i teachings on conflict resolution also emphasize consultation as a primary method of resolving conflicts. This approach involves open and respectful dialogue, where participants are encouraged to speak honestly and listen sincerely. Now, also included in this approach is detachment. Detachment from personal ego. That's a tough one, right? But it's that standard, it's that basis, including this detachment from personal ego. Again, in accordance with Baha'i teachings and Indigenous traditional knowledge, the focus is on the common good rather than individual triumph. Now, the important element central to conflict resolution from a Baha'i approach is also collective wisdom. And yet again, here is a similar foundational belief from the Baha'i faith that is also central to indigenous traditional knowledge. The concept of collective wisdom means by bringing together diverse perspectives, groups can arrive at a solution that best serves the interest of all. And furthermore, indigenous traditional beliefs and the Baha'i faith both agree on the focus of the collective, moving beyond personal grievances to address broader issues of the needs of the community, recognizing that true justice contributes to harmony and a unified society. At the heart of indigenous global peace building and conflict resolution is the art of indigenous diplomatic engagement, also known as indigenous diplomacy. This may be new for some folks. The common historical narrative that diplomacy was established solely by European colonial powers diminishes the complex diplomatic networks that existed among indigenous peoples around the world for ages. Again, well before European contact. Now, this misconception fails to recognize or deliberately ignore the long-established indigenous systems that were in place, focused on governance, negotiation, and interstate relations. Indigenous peoples all around the world, absolutely all around the world, including here in the Western Hemisphere, maintained, I would say, intricate diplomatic networks that govern trade, military and security alliances, resource sharing, and conflict resolution, again, based on mutual respect. Now, historically, among my own people, as I mentioned, I'm Apache and Yaqui from the southwestern United States. So among my own people, among the Apache and the Yaqui, both groups have a history of engaging diplomatically, of course, with other indigenous tribes in the region, but also engaging with foreign government officials from Mexico, from Spain, and the United States, from their arrival as early as 1500 to around 1850. And let me give you an example of these diplomatic networks that existed. So, for example, in 1749, which, look at the date, which was well before the U.S. became a sovereign nation, 1749. In 1749, the Apache negotiated with Spanish government authorities to establish the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. Now, this Treaty of Peace and Friendship, this agreement was created to reduce conflict and secure trade between the Apache and the Spanish crown, which was ruled by King Ferdinand VI at the time. And furthermore, the Apache also negotiated the formation of what were known as peace villages. These peace villages were located in what is today present-day Mexico, and these peace villages were recognized areas where Apache families could settle without conflict. And also the Apache, given their traditional knowledge of the local terrain, also served as mediators, served as liaisons, and also served as peace negotiators to keep goodwill between the competing colonial powers that included the US, Spain, and Mexico. And it's also important to underscore that both the Apache and the Yaqui engage in complex diplomatic negotiations through bilingual and multilingual communication. Members of both tribes, of course, had to often negotiate, first in their traditional native language, of course, but then they'd have to shift to a second or third language, which was either English or Spanish. And this was using their own indigenous interpreters. So it was common for native peoples of the Southwest to speak several languages fluently. And I would highlight that understanding the sophistication of indigenous diplomacy remains crucial today. It's not just an important part of history. This is important because indigenous diplomacy provides important alternative models for contemporary conflict resolution, again, based on a holistic approach to building relationships. Now, the term inclusive development, which is here on the screen in front of us, that term is often used by practitioners in the international policy and international development community. And that term is often used to underscore the concept that every person, regardless of their identity, has an instrumental part in playing an important part in transforming their community. We all have an important role to play in our community. That's what inclusive development means. We all have a role to play. And this is because development procedures that are inclusive yield better outcomes for the communities that embark upon them. Now, that said, I would underscore that Indigenous peoples are uniquely positioned to develop and implement culturally appropriate and sustainable solutions, and must be seen as equal partners in the creation and implementation of local, regional, national, and global policies and strategies. Living on the front lines of climate change, global Indigenous peoples are among the most at risk to its impact, without a doubt. They are on the front lines of climate change. However, once again, Indigenous peoples, drawing on their traditional knowledge and resources, environmental outcomes are demonstrated to be far better in territories that are controlled by Indigenous peoples. And let me give you an example of this. We're all familiar with what's happening in the Brazilian Amazon. Now, in the Brazilian Amazon, the deforestation rate in territories managed by Indigenous peoples is less than 10% of the deforestation rate found in the rest of the Brazilian Amazon. Again, this is because it's being managed by Indigenous peoples. We also see similar results in other parts of the world where Indigenous people manage their native land. For example, in Kenya and Tanzania, the Maasai people have traditionally coexisted with wildlife in the savanna by engaging in sustainable grazing practices that maintain grasslands, ecosystems, and support biodiversity in both countries. This is a long-held belief and tradition of the Maasai. Again, we see the positive results when Indigenous peoples are given that opportunity to manage their own land, their own Indigenous territory. Now, I've previously mentioned a few of the foundational principles of the Baha'i faith that we've talked about today. Among these principles is the belief of progressive revelation. Progressive revelation, very brief definition, is the acceptance that God's truth is revealed gradually over time through a series of divine messengers. Baha'is view all major world religions as chapters of one continuous progressive revelation from God, and the recognition that the prophets or divine manifestations of these same religious traditions bring spiritual teachings appropriate to humanity's evolving capacity and needs. That, in a nutshell, is progressive revelation. Now, among some Indigenous cultures, the foundational belief in spiritual intergenerational wisdom emphasizes the importance of learning from our ancestors, our elders, and yes, our prophets and the world around us. The distribution of knowledge, the teachings, the spiritual values and wisdom and experience through these Indigenous beliefs is shared through oral traditions. It can be shared through ceremony, and at times shared through storytelling. And the sharing of these spiritual traditions among Indigenous peoples is regarded as timeless, seamless, and sacred, very central to progressive revelation. Central to the belief of progressive revelation and intergenerational knowledge is the acknowledgement from both that spiritual truth unfolds gradually through time. Both progressive revelation and indigenous intergenerational wisdom both view spiritual wisdom and knowledge as something that accumulates and evolves over generations. It is not static or isolated to a single time. Both also recognize that spiritual teachings and understanding deepen over time. These spiritual teachings deepen over time, and that each generation has a responsibility to recognize, to honor, and preserve and apply this sacred wisdom and these teachings to the needs of the present day. I would say equally important is that both progressive revelation and indigenous intergenerational wisdom both honor those who carry and transmit spiritual truth, whether they are elders of a community or a messenger of God. And both acknowledge that spiritual truth is not fixed, but matures with experience, understanding, and most of all, divine timing. We've come together to explore how Indigenous peoples are a source for greater stability, security, prosperity around the world, and how these beliefs are in agreement with the principles of the Baha'i faith. So the questions that I usually receive, so why is the participation of Indigenous peoples necessary for a more secure and peaceful world? Why is the special station and acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples prophesied by Abdu'l-Baha so important? The bottom line, I would say, is the exclusion and marginalization of over 400 million Indigenous peoples from fully participating has severely limited the development and the prosperity that could benefit the entire global community. Meaningful societal transformation requires the full participation and empowerment of all people today. Today, we examine the appreciable, the palpable, and the tangible contributions of Indigenous peoples. However, beyond this, it is important to underscore and absolutely understand that the contributions, these Indigenous contributions, such as gender equality, Indigenous peace building, conflict resolution, diplomacy, etc. These are all rooted in a foundation of a long-held spiritual beliefs and values. Again, these are based on spiritual beliefs. And this is what makes Indigenous contributions, I believe, unique and sustainable. Ultimately, the key role Indigenous peoples will play is based on spiritual transformation. And this, I believe, is about co-creating a new global paradigm of human understanding. Indigenous traditions offer a powerful reminder that spiritual evolution is indeed a collective journey, one that requires listening, learning, and honoring the diverse traditional knowledge and spiritual traditions that have sustained Indigenous peoples for millennia. This vision of spiritual leadership, which I believe is at the foundation of Abdu'l-Baha's prophecy, emerges not from economic or political or even technological advancement, but instead from a profound capacity to recognize, respect, and integrate the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom of Indigenous peoples into society. And I believe not allowing for a diverse perspective hinders humanity's ability to achieve its collective destiny, and preventing even a segment of humanity to express or achieve its full capability is detrimental to the rest of our global society. For far too long, Indigenous peoples have been categorized as historical figures whose time has passed. But instead, the global community must acknowledge the diverse, essential global contributions of Indigenous peoples and recognize these contributions as a significant element in the construction of a unified world and the establishment of a global civilization. And let me say this: the Baha'i faith envisions a future where all people from across the world contribute their unique gifts to the betterment of humanity. As Indigenous peoples, with our rich spiritual heritage, traditional knowledge systems, recognized resilience, and intergenerational wisdom, we, as Indigenous peoples, are indeed poised to play a central role in fulfilling this vision. In conclusion, let me share just a few final thoughts with each and every one of you. And I thank you again for participating today. A few final thoughts. First, I ask that each one of you help amplify Indigenous voices and perspectives, that you do so, that you find opportunities where Indigenous peoples can offer new perspectives and viewpoints as active and key participants of our global community. And next, I challenge you. I challenge each and every one of you to think differently about the role of Indigenous peoples in our global future. As Indigenous peoples, we are not just survivors of historical injustices, but instead bearers of solutions to contemporary global challenges. Indigenous traditional knowledge systems developed over millennia offer frameworks for addressing complex issues, again, from climate change to conflict resolution, and we are key elements in today's global discourse. And finally, let me just underscore the future of our global community depends increasingly on our ability to recognize and amplify Indigenous voices, traditional knowledge, and spiritual leadership. When we come together and we talk about innovative solutions to global challenges, we absolutely must include Indigenous perspectives, not as historical footnotes. Again, not as historical footnotes, but instead as current guides to sustainable, peaceful, and a prosperous future for all of humanity. I absolutely, truly believe by embracing these contributions and working together to acknowledge and overcome past injustices, the American continent, as promised by Abdu'l-Baha, can indeed lead the world spiritually, guided by the light of unity and the spiritual contributions of its Indigenous peoples. And with that, I absolutely thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking on such an important topic. We really appreciate your insights. Now we have some time for Q&A, so if people have questions, you can put it in the chat. The first question is, how do you define an Indigenous person or culture?
That's a very good question. And it has to be done by the Indigenous peoples themselves. It's about empowerment, and it's about Indigenous peoples being Indigenous and knowing what that means as an Indigenous person. I dare not speak for all Indigenous peoples. I am able to speak for my own people, for my own tribe, and I do that with humility and with honor. But I do it knowing my background. I do knowing my history and my tradition, which are different from so many others. And we are such a diverse. Let me emphasize this as well. We are so diverse in who we are as a people, and we also have to acknowledge that. And it's also important to acknowledge these beautiful differences that exist, but also these similarities that exist. And so one way that the world looks at Indigenous peoples is through the United Nations, which I mentioned, and the UN places that responsibility on Indigenous peoples to define themselves.
I know you touched on this a bit, but how do the Baha'i teachings support or encourage the preservation and revitalization of indigenous languages and traditions?
Oh, great question. I am truly honored to, and I thank my parents and I thank the elders before me for teaching me the traditional uh, wisdom and traditional knowledge systems of my family, of my tribe. And I thank them for also sharing the Baha'i faith with me. Because that profound gift, that blessing they have given me as a Baha'i, absolutely supports and continues to encourage me as an Indigenous person to keep my native language, to honor my native traditions. We saw I mentioned the history, unfortunately, the world history, the global history of what's happened in boarding schools, not only in America, but happened around the world, in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, and so many places around the world where Indigenous peoples lived. And we saw what happened when people lose their culture and people are taken away in the name of religion, in the name of God, to forget that. The Baha'i faith teaches that you will keep that, you will express that, they encourage that. The Baha'i faith it welcomes me as an Indigenous person, welcomes my language, welcomes my unique perspectives as an Indigenous person, welcomes my culture, my singing, my dancing. It's welcomed, it's appreciated, absolutely.
Thank you. How can we learn from Indigenous culture to reduce the impact of climate change on the world?
Absolutely important, without a doubt, and it's an issue we're all facing. As I mentioned, Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of this issue, without a doubt, facing severe drought, facing famine, facing flooding, and so many other things. It is important to invite, as I mentioned, these new perspectives, allow and find opportunities where Indigenous peoples can be part of this process. We've seen it internationally happen. We've seen it around the world where Indigenous peoples that are on the front lines of these issues are able to speak, to share historically what they have done, how they have done in the past, and what they can do and bring to the table in the future. And it's important to continue to have these conversations, to allow and expand the table of knowledge, to expand the table so that people can come together and have different perspectives and have new understandings of these Indigenous traditional systems that exist, and so that we can get these new perspectives to come together as a global community to work on these important issues.
Thank you. Who do you recognize as the past prophet of your tribe?
There are many. There are many prophets, and there are many leaders, and there are many spiritual leaders. And one of the leaders that I included in some of the photographs was on there, and I don't want to share too much because it's such an important spiritual responsibility and a deeply held personal view. But I did share the photo of her in one of the slides as a young girl, and she was quite an amazing individual who was courageous and who fought for her people and was seen and still seen as a leader, even as a young girl all the way up to a young woman.
Thank you. To your knowledge, are there any other Indigenous groups or nations that lived on the North American continent other than who are referred to as the Native Americans today?
On the North American continent, so you're talking Canada, all throughout Mexico. Oh yeah, I mean, I encourage you to study, to look more, to develop that greater perspective of the diverse cultures that existed all the way from Mexico through Canada, the Yukon, the Arctic, and around the world. As I mentioned, you're looking at over 500 million Indigenous peoples across our world. That's amazing. Over 500 million of us. across our world. And let me share this, which I didn't share in the presentation. The majority, people look at North America and the Western Hemisphere, and yes, we have a number of indigenous tribes and cultures that existed and continue to exist here in this part of the world. But the largest number of indigenous peoples is actually in Asia. In Asia. So think about that. Hopefully that gives you a perspective of how much there is to gather and to understand of indigenous peoples around the world.
How might one balance asserting cultural or traditional identity with efforts to create common ground with majority communities?
I think I would say as an indigenous person, I'm honored, and I believe other indigenous peoples that I've talked to as well feel honored because they can serve as that bridge. They can serve as that bridge between different cultures and different ideas and different perspectives. Given the spiritual understanding and the spiritual background that exists among indigenous peoples, sometimes doesn't exist among other cultures. While it does exist, it may not be foundational, or it may be had lost over time. And I will just speak as an indigenous person. It's who we are as a people. It's our base, and so we bring that spirituality to the table. And I've been in meetings where indigenous peoples open up and with a prayer. And I've been in global conversations and international conversations where maybe indigenous peoples aren't fully represented, and there is no talk about spirituality. There's no talk about even opening with a prayer. But when you invite indigenous peoples to be part of that, it truly changes the whole mindset, the whole perspective, the whole dynamic of a meeting, because you open with prayer, you open with remembering the elders and remembering those before you, and it opens up to just a whole new perspective and ideas and dynamics of countless ways to collaborate.
Do schools teach about the indigenous peoples of their countries?
It's been a long time since I've been in school, so I didn't. I would, and if it was very rare for me when I did. I believe some countries. I don't have kids in school right now, so I can't really speak to that. Maybe others could, but I know when I was in school, it was very rare and it was very limited. Hopefully, it's more. There's more of an opportunity. Some countries I know and absolutely do, but it's been a long time since I have. But this is why these conversations are so important, so that we can continue to understand and learn something from each and every one of us, to learn from each other, to be part of this. It's about having this important conversation. So this is why I think these kind of conversations are important.
What would you suggest that Black and Indigenous people do together to speed the process of the spiritual transformation of this country and the world?
My previous conversation or presentation that I think is recorded on your website as well talks about that. It talks about the importance and the lost history, the history we've lost, forgotten, or don't want to remember, between indigenous peoples and African Americans, and the importance, the holistic collaboration that has existed for a long time between these two peoples, given the horrific history they've faced, given their belief in a creator, given their belief of working together, of collaboration. I think there's so much that we can learn from each other by coming together, that we have so much in common, so much that we can work together on and unite and become a unified society and help bring the world to greater unity. And I think there are endless conversations that we should have and must have and continue to have, that we need to be done. If you have the time, look on the website. I know it's on the YouTube website. I've done several of them on the importance of indigenous peoples and African Americans coming together, looking at the history and looking ahead to the future, and why this is so important. And again, these are both prophecies in the Baha'i faith as well, that need to be examined and brought together.
Thank you. Yeah, and those talks are on our YouTube channel, so you can go and find it. They're, yeah, really interesting. The next question is, I appreciate the multi-layered perspectives here. How do the histories of intertribal warfare fit into the overall picture? What were those values and learnings about justice?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those are absolutely key, and those are things you have to look back at as with any conflict, any ideas of violence, even coming to conflict resolution, right? Nothing is ever going to be sacred, and nothing's ever going to be perfect. You have to go back and look at what happened. It's about those ideas of conflict resolution coming back together in these peace circles to be able to look and consult and say what happened, why did it fail, and it's about those times of greed. It might be a time of resources not being shared. It might be a time under difficult political circumstances and survival as well. So yes, there were absolutely those times that existed. There were those times that existed between the U.S. and my own tribe. The Indian Wars of the Apache was fought to the very end, and members of the tribe were sent off away from our traditional lands. Absolutely. But it's important to look at those opportunities that existed, those opportunities that are not known, like these peace circles, like these peace villages, like these negotiations that happen between others and the Apache and the Yaqui, because those I think are key to understand, and those don't get the time and the necessary attention that they should.
How can local Baha'i communities respectfully engage with Indigenous knowledge without appropriating or diluting it?
Absolutely, great question. Work with your Indigenous peoples. Empower, invite them to be leaders in your community. Invite them to be an active role and participant, but do it in a respectful manner. Do it with humility. If we follow Abdul Baha's uh, footsteps of being humble, of serving and inviting with humility, you will see the power that inviting and respecting and bringing Indigenous perspectives to your Baha'i communities and other communities beyond that will be absolutely amazing, will be so powerful, absolutely powerful, in line with the teachings of the faith and in line with Abdul Baha's prophecy.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. We really appreciate all your time. Thank you for answering our questions. And we hope to have you again sometime in the future.
Thank you. It's my honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So our next speaker next week will be Dr. Habib Riazetti, and his topic will be the meaning and the implications of knowing one's true self and detachment from ego. So these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I've put the link to our mailing list and our YouTube channel. We're going to post this talk there afterwards, and we post all of our talks there. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good week, and we'll see you next week. Bye.